Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and we are back once again for our weekly series, and in this particular series we're going to be playing a Simic clone deck, essentially. This is kind of a ramp deck, but also in a way a combo deck at the same time. So what we want to be doing with this particular list is ramping up really early with things like Growth Spiral, New Horizons, Incubation Druid, and we want to get into our big threats, which are Tendershoot Dryad, Biogenic Ooze, and Carnage Tyrant. So we want to be getting to 5 or 6 mana by about turns 3 or 4, just so we can play these guys down. And once they're down, seems as though they're very big threats, what we want to be doing then is making extra copies of them. So we have 4 copies of Quasi-Duplicate and 2 copies of Replicate over here as well to create some more tokens. So that's basically the idea. We can, in theory, by turn 4, have either a Tendershoot or a Biogenic Ooze with a clone effect ready to go as well. So that is the absolute nut draw that I have managed to pull off once or twice, and it is pretty sickening. So let's talk about the cards in a little bit more detail, shall we? The one that most of us will know about already is Carnage Tyrant. This is a 6 mana 7/6 that can't be countered. So this is the perfect answer, essentially, against the control matchup. 7/6 that can't be countered, basically demands a board wipe, and it also has trample and hexproof as well, so can't be targeted, and it will go through pretty much anything that our opponent has to offer, which makes it a great target for our Quasi-Duplicates and Replicates. So, as far as our clones are concerned, we do have 2 copies of Replicate in here, which is a Simic color combo, 1 green and a blue, to create a token that is a copy of target creature you control. So it is a slightly underpowered version of Quasi-Duplicate, which is harder to cast. However, it does have Jumpstart, which essentially says you can discard a card to cast it from your graveyard. So this is actually copies 7 through 10, essentially, that kind of thing. So yeah, we get to reuse Quasi-Duplicate over and over again, which is why we're running more copies of this than we are Replicate. Replicate does have a split side to it, though. It does have, for 2 Simic Hybrid, we can counter target activated or triggered abilities. So that is most likely going to be used against Planeswalkers, but for the most part, not likely to see too much use. But it's something to keep in mind. You can, like, repudiate a detention tower targeting your Carnage Tyrant to try to get rid of hexproof, that kind of thing. Some really minor little upsides of having repudiate in your hand. So pretty cool. Our other 2 creatures that we want to be cloning as well are Tendershoot Dryad, which comes out of Rivals of Ixalan. 5 mana 2/2 with Ascend, which means if we have the City's Blessing, 10 or more permanents, then we get to activate a new part of this card. The main reason we run this, though, is because it says at the beginning of each upkeep, which includes our opponent's and our own, you create a 1/1 green Saproling creature token. So this creates extra copies on the board to allow you to go wide. And if you have the City's Blessing, those Saprolings become 3/3. Effectively, they just get +2/+2. So the more clones that we have of Tendershoot Dryad, the more Saprolings we're going to be making each turn, which means that the Ascend is going to super quickly get triggered. But also, we get extra Lord effects as well. So those 3/3s become 5/5s, become 7/7s. Depending on the amount of copies of Tendershoot Dryad we have, we go wide, and those Saprolings are essentially just going to be running right through our opponent. Same kind of thing for the Biogenic Ooze as well. This one's coming out of Ravnica Allegiances and basically has spawned this deck idea in a nutshell. 5 mana for a 2/2, so it does die to a fair few things, but if we can get it down nice and early, we shouldn't really have to worry about a great deal of things. But it also, when it enters the battlefield, creates itself a 2/2 green ooze creature token as well. So it's going to put 4 power onto 2 bodies right away. And then at the beginning of our end step, it puts a 1/1 counter on each ooze you control. So if it survives the turn, we actually have 6 power, 2 3/3s over 2 bodies for our opponent to deal with. And then extra copies of this card make extra oozes, which also create extra +1/+1 counter end step triggers as well. So this card is basically the thing that makes this deck spiral out of control if it is left alone. It also has the ability as well to pay 1 and 3 green to create a 2/2 green ooze creature token. So if when we enter the battlefield we have that ooze token and it does somehow die, maybe we're forced to block with it or something like that, we can pay 4 mana to make some more oozes, which will then get the counters from them as well. Very nice stuff indeed. So how do we get to all of this stuff? Because this is quite expensive. Well, the way that we're going to go about this is our ramp package. We have 4 copies of Incubation Druid. It's a 2 mana 0/2 that adds 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. However, if it does have a +1/+1 counter on it, then Incubation Druid suddenly adds 3 mana of whatever type that is instead. And we can either go about putting a counter on it ourselves, or we can pay the 5 mana Adapt 3, which puts 3 counters on it and triggers it that way as well. If we've been ramping, then we can pay that cost quite effectively. The way that we put the counters on it, though, without the Adapt is going to be using New Horizons. New Horizons is very similar to Gift of Paradise, which you see a lot in the Turbo Fog matches, but this one actually synergizes with Incubation Druid quite nicely as well. 3 mana, enchant a land. When it ends the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 on target creature you control. So we effectively target Incubation Druid on turn 3, which makes New Horizons free to cast, because Incubation Druid suddenly will produce 3 mana as well. So this is completely free, and then when it attaches to a land, it allows us to add 2 mana of any one colour as well off of that land. So really, really nice ramping there as well. We also have 4 copies of Growth Spiral, which allow us to get through our deck via cantrips, green and a blue, draw a card, and then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So if we do have quite a flooded hand and we have Growth Spirals in hand, then we get to make extra land drops for the turn as well. It's a great way to get our turn 4 Ooze or Dryad plus Clone effect. It's a combination of Druid, Growth Spiral, and New Horizons that allow us to do that kind of thing. We can also filter through our deck to find what we need with things like Opt, which is 1 blue, scry 1 and draw a card, so we get to go find the pieces that we are missing, perhaps. We also have Chemist's Insight as well. 3 copies of this one, 4 and a blue for an instant speed, draw 2 cards, and then it has Jumpstart as well. Similar to Quasi-Duplicate, we can discard a card from our hand, maybe some excess card that we don't need, to draw some extra cards again. So very, very nice card advantage indeed. We will have a lot of mana to work with as well, so it's not out of the question that we can actually use Chemist's Insight twice in a single turn to just really, really fly through our deck and find what we need. Finally, the last piece, which seems a little bit maybe interesting, is 3 copies of Root Snare. Root Snare, for those who don't know, allows us to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn for just 2 mana at instant speed. This card is a lifesaver. It's also a game winner as well. I've had a few games recently. If you follow me on Discord, which link is in the description because it's public and you should all be there, you'll have seen a screenshot where I actually won a game using Root Snare. My opponent all attacked me thinking that they'd won. I prevented all the combat damage, and then my Biogenic Ooze army and Carnage Tyrants swung back for lethal, and we got a wonderful little oops emote. It was sensual. But anyway, it's also really good against the early game aggro stuff, which just allows us to slap down our board, because if we are dealing with a very, very wide board, the likelihood is that we need a little bit of time to deal with it, and by the time that we've settled our stuff, we always have like oozes and dryads generating plenty of creatures on board, which then allow us to block all of that creature army. So that's essentially the main board. We have 8 islands and 8 forests. Nice even balance here. And 4 copies of Breeding Pool and 4 Hinterland Harbours, as all decks of 2 colours should include, if you have the opportunity to do that. Onto the sideboard. So we are very goldfishy in a sense. We don't really care what our opponent's doing too much. We just kind of want to race to our game plan, which then allows us to just steamroll through whatever they've planned to do. So if we want to start reacting to our opponent, that's basically where the sideboard comes in. We got 3 copies of Shaper's Sanctuary as a defensive card. 1 green mana for an enchantment. It's the best time to cast this spell is on turn 1, because we don't really have anything to do other than opting. It says, whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or an ability your opponent controls, you may draw a card. So while we cannot save our creatures, like Dryad and Ooze, we actually can replace them all the same. So we get to draw a card if our opponent Chupacabras our Dryad or casts down or something like that. We at least get some value back from it, and the more Shaper's Sanctuaries we have, the more cards that we will draw from it, which then allow us to rebuild quite quickly. We also have 2 copies of Blink of an Eye, mostly for enchantments like Ixalan's Binding, and Conclave Tribunal just allows us to bounce back whatever we might have lost and get some value from it, because of course we do have Enter the Battlefield abilities with Biogenic Ooze, and then upkeep on our turn kind of abilities there as well, so there is value in end stepping and getting back a creature in that sense. It also has Kicker as well for 1 and a blue. Allows us to draw a card if we do have the excess mana, which, as we mentioned, we generate a lot of it, so it's a nice little mana sink for an extra little bit of value. Against the control decks or heavy removal decks, we have 4 copies of Negate as well. Counters target non-creature spell, so all the removal, all the planeswalkers, any enchantments and things like that, we want to bring this one in versus control if they don't allow us to resolve any of our spells. If we're having trouble getting a Tender Shoot Dryad down through counter magic, that's when negates and things like that will come in. We also have another copy of Root Snare as well for the aggro matchup. If it is indeed quite a useful card, we'll bring in the 4th copy. There's a lot of cards like that. We'll just bring in the extra copy if we can. 2 copies of Admiral's Order, just because Settle the Wreckage is a thing, and it's basically the best way for us to deal with it. It's essentially a Sinister Sabotage. However, if we're on the attack, then we actually get to pay 1 blue rather than the 3 mana to counter a target spell. So it's like a hard-casted Spell Pierce in that sense. So if we swing in with absolutely everything they settle us, we can 1 mana counter it, which is very nice. Allows us to use the rest of our mana as well for like negates and all of that shenanigans. Do quite like this card. It's not necessary as well. If you don't include this card in your deck for budget reasons, then you can go with the 3 mana spells. I just figured this one would be quite a nice little tactic for us. 2 copies of Murmuring Mystic as well as our Drake counter. 4 mana for a 1/5, which makes it very hard to deal with. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you get to create a 1/1 blue bird illusion token with flying. So the idea is, if you've ever seen the Mystic budget deck that I built, that we want to be duplicating this one instead, and all of our opponents' 24 Drakes can't really get past bird tokens. We more than cover the instant and sorcery count for this card as well. Likelihood is that we end up bringing in Admiral's Orders and Root Snares and Negates anyway, so our instant and sorcery count goes way through the roof if we are up in a Drake's matchup anyway. So copying this is likely to be the end of the game for our opponent, short of them getting something like a Niv Mizzet, and by the time that's a problem, we'll probably have some Carnage Tyrants. Speaking of, as we mentioned, Carnage Tyrant is the best anti-counter creature that we have available, so we have the 4 copy in the sideboard as well, because, you know, getting these down can be a little bit difficult, so we'll probably swap one of those out for the Carnage Tyrant, depending on the kind of control that we are ending up dealing with. So that's essentially the deck, guys. I hope you enjoy the look of this one. If you do, then be sure to stick around. The link is down in the description for the deck list if you want to import it into the game yourself, as well as the link to the first match, which will be down in the description and on the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe if you have. It helps out the channel a great deal, as well as hitting the little bell icon as well, so that you get notifications when wonderful little spicy brews like this turn up in the future. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.